Welcome to the state of the war in Ukraine. We're honored that Ambassador Sergiy Kyslytsya is joining us today to discuss his work in the United Nations and his country's efforts to repel the Russian invasion. The ambassador will be in conversation with Perry Roldhouse visiting fellow and Philadelphia Inquirer worldview columnist Trudy Rubin. But before we begin the program, it's my great honor to welcome to the stage the University of Pennsylvania's interim president, Wendell Pritchett, who will formally introduce our esteemed guests in a moment. President Pritchett is a proud alum, having received a PhD in history from Penn. In addition to being president, he is the presidential professor of law and education. President Pritchett has held numerous leadership positions across Penn, and you're all super familiar with them, but I'll tell you anyway, including senior advisor to then President Amy Gutman, University Provost, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and Interim Dean. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Director Jefferson, for that lovely introduction. So as always, and many of you know this, when the University of Pennsylvania engages in the most consequential conversations of our time, we do so here at Perry Roldhouse. And this is a really important conversation. So today is the 49th day since the Russian state invaded Ukraine, launching the largest land war in Europe since World War II. All of us follow closely the events unfolding there. Our hearts break when we witness the untold suffering of the Ukrainian people, the unprovoked destruction of their homes and hospitals, and the all-out assault launched by President Putin against a fellow democracy. We are appalled and outraged. But together with the world, we also feel enormous admiration for the bravery of the Ukrainian people. Daily, hourly, and with terrible sacrifice against a ruthless invader, they show all of us just how precious and how hard-won liberty truly is. Ukrainian courage and perseverance serve as most compelling reminders that no one can take life for granted or liberty and the pursuit of happiness, the things that we hold most dear. We must always stand united against forces that would steal away or stamp out these precious things, even and especially when the fight seems far away. It's a fight that involves all of us. As a preeminent global university, Penn not only prepares citizens to engage fully in democratic life, we seek to better understand the greatest challenges of our time, and we aim to contribute to solutions that improve and save lives. In that spirit, it's my great privilege to introduce our honored guest today. He serves as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Ukraine and Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations. Before becoming ambassador, he served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, a post he assumed in 2014, the same year Russia annexed Crimea. Prior to that, he served in multiple roles at the Embassy of Ukraine in Washington, D.C., and he might even tell us about his time much longer ago in Lawrence, Kansas. Awarded with the Order of Merit of the Third Degree by his country, he has championed Ukraine powerfully and compellingly on the global stage throughout the Russian invasion. We're honored to have him today. On behalf of Penn, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ambassador Sergiy Kyslytsya. And as LaShawn said, after the ambassador gives some opening remarks, he will be joined by our colleague, Trudy Rubin, who is a nominee for the Pulitzer Prize twice, author of several books, including Willful Blindness, the Bush Administration in Iraq, and we're very pleased to have her joining us again. So please, again, join me in welcoming Ambassador.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And what a challenge, really, seriously. I tell you a secret, the only reason I agreed to be here is because Trudy asked me, otherwise I would say no. You know, I have this kind of relationship with her, which is very short in time, but is full of empathy and trust. So when she suggested to me, why don't you come? I trusted her. So, and I'm also intimidated after sitting here for half a day and listening to all those wise people and seasoned politicians and seasoned diplomats like Ambassador Vershbow, whom I've been observing for ages, being very junior, and he has already been someone on the Olympus of diplomacy. Anyway, I have no prepared speech. And the reason I didn't prepare any speeches because I came here as a friend to meet friends. So I need to prepare my speeches when I go to a Security Council, which is a very toxic environment where you have to be very careful about what you say, and you have to verify the facts and the political positions. But here I'm open to whatever questions you may ask. You may say why many times, because why is the most abused letter in the spelling of my last name. It's totally unpronounceable. But my last name makes my Irish colleague in New York very happy because it means in English shamrock. So now and then she sends me something shamrocky, and I'm very happy for that. I would like to, however, start our dialogue with throwing two quotations and then probably kicking our discussion off from that. Let me quote my, by far, the most favorite Secretary General of the United Nations, and you may try to guess who said that. It is when we all play safe that we create a world of utmost insecurity. Said many years ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. In fact, he was inaugurated as Secretary General in April, if I'm not mistaken, on the 10th of April, 69 years ago. And he, in my opinion, was the most charismatic and the most outspoken, and probably no prejudice to the current Secretary General, very defensive in terms of how he sees the role of any Secretary General of the United Nations. I would also like to quote my president when he addressed the General Assembly in September. And he said, I quote, "Criticism of the United Nations is often heard, but we criticize ourselves. UN is not a building. UN is leaders, and it was they who created the United Nations 76 years ago. And we really have to keep it in mind when we criticize the United Nations, because we criticize, first of all, ourselves, our own nations, our own governments. And before we blame someone else in the building, in the house of the United Nations, we have to ask ourselves, and we have to ask our governments, have we done everything right? And I don't think that we have done anything right. One of the reasons we are at the point where we are today, and I use this allegory very often, probably it's already too much abused allegory. I say Russian government, Russian regime is like toxic mold that we let to be planted on the building, on the structure of the United Nations more than 40 years ago. And instead of scrapping the mold to the healthy part of the bones, to the healthy part of the building, we were putting the fresh layer of paint over the mold. Occupation of Transnistria, fresh layer of paint. Occupation of Georgia, fresh layer of paint. Syria, fresh layer of paint. Attempted annexation of Crimea. In fact, it is attempted illegal annexation. It's not annexation, by the way. Fresh layer of paint. Invasion in eastern Ukraine, fresh layer of paint. And now we wonder, why did it happen? And the problem is that under those many layers of paint, there is a rotten structure. And I'm afraid if we do not really take immediate actions One day you can approach the United Nations, push it with a finger, and it will collapse. And it will collapse in a new world environment where you won't have a desert, you will have something new built by a very powerful country discussed in the last session as a parallel structure, which may be not true, but that is a very dangerous scenario. Therefore, I continue to defend the United Nations. And I have daily conversations with my capital about why we should defend the United Nations. Because destroying the United Nations is what the evil wants. In reply, some of those whom I talk to remind me of the latest address by President Zelensky to the Security Council, where he said, then we have to dissolve the United Nations. But that is a cherry picking of from the speech of my president. Because before he said, then we have to dissolve the United Nations, he said, we have to make the last effort to reform the United Nations. And if we fail to reform the United Nations, then we have to dissolve the United Nations. But that is the most unfortunate scenario that any of us really wishes. So with that, I'm happy to see next to me Trudy, and I am in your hands, Trudy.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to pick up just where you left off. As you said, your president said, what's the point of the UN if it can't act against crimes against humanity and punish the perpetrators because Russia has a veto? And then he called for reform. Since he made that speech and in the weeks since the invasion, have you seen any signs that the UN is capable of reform, any signs of change, or are we still in the same morass that President Zelensky recognized when he made his speech?
Right. Well, that's an existential question, actually. And people and the human nature probably is willing to discuss existential questions, but very much unwilling to act. You know, that's basically the trap of the Russian mentality and Russian philosophy, because if you remember the titles of their most important books, like Who is Guilty and What to Do, and then they will dwell on that forever. The issue and the problem of reform of the United Nations is with us for at least 15, 20 years. Every year we have this process of intergovernmental negotiations that every year ends in total debacle when people are not even ready to agree on conclusions, and we have this non-paper with diversions and common points.
So is it of any use in the Ukraine crisis?
The Security Council is a child of three fathers. And then there were two foster fathers as well. I mean, three fathers were the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Britain, and the Soviet dictator Stalin, who met in Yalta and then in San Francisco, And when everything was already decided, they invited France and China. The Security Council was designed based on the experience of the United States of League of Nations, or rather with the experience why the United States never joined the League of Nations. And as you remember, President Woodrow Wilson spent a lot of time and efforts promoting the project of League of Nations. Then he sent the bill to the Congress, and Congress said, no, we are not going to join the League of Nations because we have no way to control the decision-making process. And if we cannot control the decision-making process, then we are not going to be part of it. So when they met in Yalta and then in San Francisco, they designed a system where permanent members have the way to control everything. Sounds all right. The UK doesn't really avail of the right to veto since 1989. France is quite moderate. The US is very decisive. And the Soviet Union and now Russia abuses.
So let's be blunt. Can we get rid of Russia from the Security Council? I know you have had an idea.
Well, first of all, it's kind of about semantics, but also about legality. When people call me and say, why don't you put to a vote stripping Russia of their membership? I say, I cannot strip Russia from their membership. And they say, why? Because I say, Russia is not a member. Russia occupies the seat of the Soviet Union. And in fact, if you open the Article 23 of the Charter, you will read that it is the United States, France, China, the UK, and the Soviet Union that is still the member of the Security Council according to the Charter. What happened in 1991, in December, when the Security Council was presided by the Soviet Union? Attention, the Russian Federation was presiding the Security Council in February 2022. At the end of one of the meetings, the Soviet ambassador Vorontsov told the members of the council, I would like to inform you that President Yeltsin sent a letter to the Secretary General in which he informed of the desire of Russia to be a continuator state to the Soviet Union in the Security Council and in the United Nations. And he also said, from now on, I'm going to be the Russian ambassador. It was a pre-Christmas atmosphere. People were happy. Someone is taking control of nukes. We are able to go on Christmas. 1st of January, the UK presidency. Then January, February, March, 1992, 93, 95, 2000, 2022, 30 years of presence of Russia in the Security Council. But let me remind you what Article 4 says, that a country can be admitted to the United Nations based on the recommendation by vote of the Security Council and the vote in the General Assembly.
And the vote was never taken.
You know, I had to do a certain experiment. I went to the General Assembly on the 2nd of March, and I addressed every member of the General Assembly, and I asked those countries who voted for the Russian membership in the United Nations or in the Security Council to raise their hand. Nobody. Nobody. So someone in the United Nations, someone quietly behind the closed doors, in violation of the Charter, on the eve of Christmas, on the eve of the New Year holidays, decided, let it be so. Why in the world the General Assembly has to exercise its right to decide whether Russia can be a continuator state? Because Yeltsin's letter could have been only an application and part of the decision-making process. And then the Security Council had to be offered a chance to say, based on the Russian desire to be a continuator state, shall we make a positive recommendation to the General Assembly? And then it would land in the General Assembly, and then the General Assembly would admit to the Russian Federation. It never happened.
So in effect, you're saying there's a loophole there that nobody has been willing to challenge. And well, you heard it here, but the question is, nobody seems willing to take that up.
I can assure you that nobody, neither Beijing, of course, no Washington, neither London, nobody wants to revisit that situation, which, however, does not change the logic and the legal analysis that I try to promote. And in fact, I think that an opportunity to revisit it will be when Putin is gone, right? When Nebenzia is gone, when we will have a new government of Russian Federation. And then we all have to decide whether we buy it for granted or take it for granted, looking in the face and in the eyes of the new government of Russia, that they are able to be a peace-loving country, as is conditioned, by the way, to be a member, you know.
Well, let us hope, but unfortunately, Mr. Putin still sits in his chair. So I want to ask you another UN question. You famously said to the Russian ambassador to the UN in the Security Council, you pointed your finger, I thought you were going to jump at him, and you said, war criminals go straight to hell. Right now, there is a lot of talk about Russia's war crimes, and President Biden has used the word genocide. How does it help Ukraine win the existential fight that they are now waging on the ground in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine on the battlefield? Does it help? How does it help to pursue questions of war crimes and genocide, which may not be decided due to legal complications for years? Does it help?
Well, you know, I need to tell you, I really regret that I didn't copyright it, what I said, because now I have different versions.
I heard it.
Right, and I saw one ambassador in Vienna, in the PC, in the Permanent Council of the OSCE, and she was wearing a sweatshirt which says, the war criminals do not go to hell, they go to the Hague first, meaning the tribunal.
To the Hague,
Yeah,
yes.
so it's kind of, you know, diversion. Probably she was not a Protestant because Protestants do not have purgatory. She probably was an Orthodox, so she still believes in purgatory, you know. But anyway, it is not up to the Security Council to decide if it is genocide or not. It is not up to the General Assembly to legally decide if it is a war crime or not. It is up to a tribunal or up to the national jurisdictions to decide whether it is a genocide or a war crime. But do I believe that it is correct for Biden, for my president, for the Prime Minister of Canada, for the President of Colombia, who twice said this week that it is a genocide, to say that it's a genocide? Absolutely. I believe that is a political statement of the leadership of many countries, and they have the right to do that. But in reply to that, I also would remind you that Ukraine stated by words and by actions that we are interested in the full, transparent investigation, in the proper collection of evidences and preservation of evidences. And we are happy that more than 14, probably already about 50 countries referred to the ICC, and that ICC opened an investigation, and the ICC team, including Han, is present in Ukraine on the ground.
Switching to the battlefield, at this point, as everyone speaks about the battle for Eastern Ukraine, a new phase, which is already beginning, does Ukraine have what it needs to defeat Russia in that battle? Or does it still need weapon systems or other kinds of aid that NATO countries, including the United States, have not yet delivered?
The most terrible way to answer is to put a question, so I put a question: does Europe, NATO, or collective civilized world provided Ukraine with enough weapons to defend collective civilized world? No. So it is not the issue of how to equip or provide enough weapons to Ukraine to defend Ukraine. It is how, cynically speaking, is in the intrinsic interest of every European nation and collective civilized world to do everything possible and to provide Ukraine with everything possible so that the Putin's regime is defeated by the Ukrainians. But the direct answer to your question is not enough. And that is why we continue quiet but very intense conversations, both on bilateral level with multiple nations and multilateral discussions about how we may receive the necessary weapons and arms.
Can you describe what a victory for Ukraine / for the democratic world in Ukraine, what would that victory have to look like?
The victory for all of us is not the military victory in the territory of Ukraine over the Russian army. The victory for the entire civilized world is putting Russia back at the very beginning of the long path towards democracy. And that is why the most dangerous scenario that I described to my colleagues ambassadors in New York is that if Russia is militarily defeated in Ukraine, we switch to business as usual overnight. And we look to Nebenzya's eyes and say, all right, you're defeated, but let's have business with you. Or we receive delegations from Putin's government and we say, let's have business with you. That will be the most ugly scenario. And then you don't even need the toxic mold to destroy everything. So we have to be mentally, politically, militarily, and economically ready for a long haul process that stretches well beyond the point of military defeat of the Russian army in the territory of Ukraine. So the ultimate victory is the moment when the Russian people abandon this scenario that's been so deeply ingrained in their mentality by Putin, and they tell themselves, we need to return to the path of democracy, and they will take meaningful, verifiable actions and steps towards building democratic Russia.
But in the meantime, you say that's a long struggle, and many analysts and government officials are talking, I think General Milley talking about a long war. If this war is protracted, if it drags on with the Russians holding out in the sections of territory that they now have a grip on, Mariupol, Kherson, those areas, how does Ukraine survive this? What will it need from the outside world to keep its economy alive, to keep this battle alive? Can Ukraine, as some people cynically claim, fight to the last Ukrainian to save the West?
I think that we can survive as long as Europe and North America and other countries around the world, be it Australia, New Zealand, Latin American countries. There are very good quality governments in Central and Latin America as well. So we should not really limit our definition of collective democratic world just to Europe and North America. If they continue to be our partners and if they continue to work with us together and support us economically and militarily, so with them it is achievable. After all, Ukraine is not the first country that might join NATO or European Union, which is more attainable, not even having the full control of its territory. We know the EU members who have no full control of their territories, still they are EU members. So if we are able to ensure sustainable security at the touchline until we regain full control of the territory, we can still advance to the European Union membership.
I'm just going to ask one more question. I'm going to go to the audience. President Zelensky has said that if there is ever to be a peace settlement, he will need a guarantee that is serious, not like the Budapest Agreement in 1994. If Ukraine cannot get an Article 5 security guarantee as a member of NATO, can you describe the kind of guarantee that Ukraine would need?
No, because it's up. This is the offer that Ukraine has made to our partners, and our partners have to have a very serious conversation and discussion with us and inside their own governments. But it's very difficult to say at this moment how they should really be put on paper.
Questions from the audience? Hands. Yes. Black and white shirt. Oh.
Please line up back here with the microphone if you have a question.
Please.
Welcome. And I'll understand if you don't want to answer this question. You know, we all watched the Press Secretary General Kirby list all of the weapons that the United States and the European countries, the NATO countries are giving to Ukraine. I'm assuming, and tell me if I'm wrong, if you want to answer the question, I'm assuming that Ukraine is getting a lot more weapons and a lot more intelligence and help that we here in this room know about, which understandably the United States and NATO does not want to publicize and broadly announce. And my question, if you want to answer it, is that happening? Are we giving more, or is Ukraine getting a lot more than we know? Or is it just what we see, what General Kirby is saying on TV? Thank you.
My answer is very simple. I don't really know what you know. So what? So I may assume that you don't know everything. Exactly. You know.
Okay, next question. And the first gentleman kept his question short and to the point. So if you all do the same, we'll try to get you all in, please.
Добрий день, без України. I just want to let you know you have a lot of friends here in Philadelphia. A lot of people are volunteering, organizing, protesting, donating. So my question is, what do you as a representative of the Ukrainian government need from us? Tell us how we can best help you.
How you should lobby your elected officials.
That's
I
number
mean,
one.
it's very good to send financial and material humanitarian help to the needy Ukrainians. But the most important things, and I believe in democracy, and I believe in the American democracy in spite of all, I believe in the system of check and balances in this country. And I think that when the US citizens write their elected officials and explain to them why constituents demand certain action from the elected officials, that's the best way to promote the only right political and military action by the government of the United States.
Дякую.
We're going to get in a question from online.
We have one question from online that draws parallels to the 1949 Russo-Finnish War and also the Korean War. So the question that they pose is there a future for Ukraine with a pro-Russian Donbass and a pro-Western rest of Ukraine?
Look, it is part of the whole Russian policy and the design that is proven to be wrong daily. There is no pro-Russian Donbass. It doesn't matter in the United States if you speak Spanish, Bengali, French, English. When it comes to the core values of this nation, the United States defends the interest of the United States collectively. I remember very well when I lived in Washington, D.C., and I saw 9/11 with my own eyes. My son used to go to a daycare next to Pentagon City, to the Pentagon, rather. And I saw the reaction of the entire American nation to the tragedy. And it didn't really matter whether you were a recent immigrant or born American. Same in Ukraine. It doesn't really matter what language do you speak. And there is a fundamental flaw of the plan of Putin, who believed that the Ukrainians, or Russians, so-called Russian-speaking Ukrainians, would welcome with flowers and with food the liberators arriving to their villages, townships, and cities on the Russian tanks. And as I said in the previous session, I don't believe that any peace deal that includes territory concessions is feasible. I can say with lots of responsibility that it is politically suicidal in Ukraine to any politician to promote a peace deal or ceasefire at the cost of territory concessions. It is another thing, however, that the Ukrainian politicians and public are informed enough and seasoned enough to understand that we may not, even defeating militarily Russia in the current war, we may not immediately regain control of occupied Crimea, because it's much more difficult than to defeat Russian army in the north or in the east or in the south. So the notion of ultimate settlement or ultimate solution should not be very simplified. It's not black and white.
Do you think the economic sanctions imposed on Russia have had an effect on pressuring President Putin or the oligarchs in stopping the war? And if you don't think they've been effective, who in Russia do you think the sanctions are affecting the most?
You know, it's a very good question because there are many misperceptions about who is the most affected by sanctions. The Russians used to live in shambles and in poverty. In fact, according to the statistics, 26% of Russian households, the last time I checked, about 2 years ago, do not have running water in their houses. So the life as you see it in Moscow or in St. Petersburg has nothing to do with life of ordinary Russians. So ordinary Russians have never had a chance to avail of the luxury, benefits, and comfort of Western life or its version in the capital. Therefore, I may say that it is exactly the oligarchs and Putin's wallets, so to say, who are hit the most at the moment. You know, because their property is seized, their yachts are seized, their palaces and houses are seized, their families stripped of their visas or their opportunity to live in Switzerland or you name it, where no regular Russians ever lived. You know? Does Putin have money to support the life of regular Russians if he cared about the life of regular Russians, even in the time of sanctions? I think yes, he does. And you know why? Because in the course of the last month, the months of war, only Europe paid the Russian government 35 billion euros for gas and oil that Europe bought from Russia. So Russia receives at least 1 billion euros daily in payments for energy resources Russia sells to Europe. So if Putin wants to feed his citizens, he still has money to buy necessary food and supply from China, from India, from other countries. It is unfortunate, however, that even in the time of war and sanctions, the money that Europe pays to Russia may not necessarily be used to pay for the public services, and they still end up in the pockets of Putin and his henchmen.
Talking about other countries, I was wondering what the current relationship between Ukraine and the rest of post-Soviet countries is looking like right now. Because
The
I
rest
think
of what countries?
of post-Soviet ones, because I think
Right.
the ones in Central Asia, for example, they've been less vocal about their opinion on the war because they've been like allies of both Ukraine and Russia, and they're kind of in the middle stage. Do you wish they did more, maybe something to support Ukraine? And
You know, it's a very tricky question because if you call any of the Baltic states a post-Soviet country, they would really protest that because they would remind you that they were never considered by themselves to be part of the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, they are the best allies of Ukraine, because I don't really know anyone more dedicated to Ukraine than a part of the United States, the UK, than Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia, you know. Georgia, yes, Georgia is a victim of aggression and occupation. Georgia is in a very, very difficult situation right now, and I regret that the Georgian government is not as straightforward on sanctions and actions against Russia as others. Moldova. But if you speak about other part of the former Soviet Union, Turkmenistan is living on a different planet. They believe that they are neutral. They never vote, neither in favor nor against. They oftentimes just abstain or are not present. Kyrgyzstan votes against us. In the last vote on the Human Rights Council membership rights of the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan voted against us. So, you know, I would not call them allies. And the very fact that you are still able to maintain amicable relationship with the government in Kazakhstan or in Kyrgyzstan or in Tajikistan does not make them allies. But it's up to their people to decide how they want to develop their countries and what kind of governments they want to have. Not up to Ukraine.
We have two questions about the role of the internet and social media in the war. Could you talk about how can Ukraine and other countries counter misinformation campaigns inside Russia? And is there any way to destabilize Putin from within? And related, how has social media affected the war and the propaganda?
Well, internet, I mean, it's a game changer. I mean, it's changed the entire world, and we are so dependent on internet. You know, it's very difficult to answer this question, but what I would like to say is that I do not buy the narrative that Russians are not responsible for what is happening because they do not have access to the information, because Putin allegedly controls the internet. No, I don't believe it. Even if they are zombied by the Russian TV, which is totally sanitized by Putin, the Russians still have internet. The Russians still travel abroad. The Russians still can call their relatives, their friends abroad. The Russians still can have access through VPN to many media outlets. The Russians simply do not want to be educated. The Russians simply do not want to digest critically the information. Even in the Soviet Union, where we had no internet, people would quietly, under their blankets, listen to the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and think about what was going on in a critical way. The Russians collectively do not want to think critically. Those Russians who claim to be in opposition to Putin, what they do? They flee Russia. Some say that there are already 1 million Russians who fled country in the recent months and a half. Did Ukrainians flee Ukraine? Did Ukrainians flee Ukraine under Yanukovych to change their destiny? No, Ukrainians took their rights to the streets, and they defended their rights to the street, in the streets. Many Russians say apologetically, you know, we should not really blame the Russians in Russia because they are so terrorized by police and by the state. I don't buy it. I don't buy it because it really requires being brave and being morally right, same as in this country. Centuries ago, when you decided to be independent. Same as in many European countries, when the Hungarians were trying to defend in 1956 their destiny, when the Czech and Slovaks were defending their country against the Soviets and against the Soviet tanks. Russians simply do not want to do that. You know, I've been asked by one of the ambassadors last night in New York, we were standing in a company of like-minded ambassadors, and that guy said, do you have an answer to a question why not a single Russian diplomat defected? Not a single one. Not a single one in New York, not a single one in London, not a single one in Paris, not a single one in any European or North American city where they all have this abundance of information. So it also illustrates, it probably supports my argument that it is not about having or not having access to information. It's about the collective complacency of the society. It does not mean that I'm Russophobic, not at all. But it also means when the victory, military victory is achieved, and when I spoke about the need to put Russia back to the beginning of the long path to democracy, it would also mean that Russia, as Germany, after the Second World War II, as Italy, would need to undergo a painful and probably long process of deputinization that requires a lot of action in the sphere of education, in the sphere of government.
I have two questions. My first question is whether or not you foresee like Russian aggression spilling over into neighboring Eastern European countries, for instance, Moldova, which is already occupied with, or the Transnistria region already contains Russian troops. And my second question, separate, how do you see rebuilding efforts after the war, both internally within Ukraine and how allies and other countries can assist with that?
Well, I have no doubts that if Ukraine fails, Putin won't be satisfied. And then, unfortunately, one small NATO country will be attacked. That is the country I won't really want to say, not to be in a diplomatic scandal, I don't really want to name this country, but that is a country that is so mentally painful for Putin, because that is a country that humiliated him so many times that he would attack that country. And then the question to me is, or maybe to Ambassador Vershbow rather, and I was so tempted to ask you when you were on the panel, do you really believe that when Putin attacks this small NATO country, will Brussels act so dramatically fast to defend that country? Or will they sit in headquarters of NATO and think, oh, you know, same as with the case of Ukraine, when they believe that Ukraine will be invaded in 2 days? Or will they think, oh, you know, that country will fail almost immediately. Why should we start the World War III? But I think that, coming back to your question, no, Putin will not stop if Ukraine fails. What was your second question?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm going to ask a question that's slightly critical, though I am very supportive of Ukraine. So a lot of the African students who were studying Ukraine when this conflict broke out were stuck there, and they faced not only the Russian assault, but discrimination from Ukrainians when they were trying to leave. And partly as a result of that, plus partly as a result of Russia's influence, a lot of African countries have not been the most supportive of you guys in the UN. What are you doing to try to win back their support?
Well, I need to thank you for your badly informed question, but by putting this badly informed question, you give me an opportunity to explain a very simple thing. Ukrainians were able to flee Ukraine as refugees because of the revolution of dignity. And I will tell you why. Because of the revolution of dignity and our engagement with the European Union, we were able to get a visa-free regime with Europe, right? So when Ukrainians arrived to the border of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, all you need to show is a Ukrainian passport, right? No questions asked from the Ukrainian border control, no questions asked from the Polish border control, right? At the initial stages, what happened to the African students? They arrived to the border. They show their passports, and they cannot cross the border. The Ukrainian border control officers were not able to process their leaving the country, because if you let someone leave Ukrainian territory on land, you would clutter this piece of land between us and Poland with someone who was not admissible to Poland, right? Right? So it took some while, and thank God it was quite rapidly processed by Brussels and by Polish government, Hungarian government. They waived visa requirements, you know? And the Africans and others, not only Africans, Indians, were allowed to leave the country and allowed to enter the Schengen zone of the European Union, right? Right, so there is no conspiracy, right? And if there are proven and verifiable instances of racial discrimination, they should be investigated, and responsible should be brought to account. So it's blown out of proportion, unfortunate technical issue that after all was resolved by the authorities of receiving countries concerned.
I'm afraid we have run out of time, but I want to thank the ambassador very much for being here and answering your questions, and thank you all for coming. And
So I guess there's no need to say, let's give our guests a round of applause. But how fortunate we are to be here today to experience, witness, be a part of, and interrogate such deep analysis and expertise about the conflict today, and to understand a little better what the road ahead is and how that road actually involves all of us. And for the ambassador's tireless efforts at the level of the UN to rally the international community to come to Ukraine's aid and to the defense of democracy and the future for all of us, and peace and security everywhere. So we are extraordinarily grateful to both of you today for being with us. I want you all to wait just 1 second while I share some announcements with you. First of all, the ambassador has to leave the stage a few minutes early, and we're going to let him and Trudy leave the stage as I'm making these last announcements. I won't be offended, but just very quickly again. And just a couple of very quick notes. We are going to have on April 19th in this same room a global lens arts and culture piece that looks at a film called The Bow from Hiroshima. You can sign up online and see that. On April 21st, we're going to have an all-day convening. Essentially, that is our annual Global Shifts Colloquium, which focuses on small island states in the front line of climate change. We'll be spending the day with leading policymakers, artists, academics, practitioners, activists, government officials, et cetera, examining how climate change is affecting small island developing states, what we can do to help, and what we can learn from them about building a resilient future. You can sign up for all of these events online. You can follow us on YouTube. You should follow us on social media, but most of all, you should make sure you come back. So goodbye to all of you online and in the room, and thanks for sharing your time with us.